Hi, my name is Dr. Lauren Hallion. So you've probably heard the phrase, don't believe everything you read. And that's good advice. Today, I'm going to be chatting with you a little bit about why it's also good advice to not believe everything you think. Our minds are not fair and balanced places where we take in information neutrally and process it exactly in line with reality. Often our thoughts can deviate from reality, can be inaccurate in systematic and predictable ways. And the ways that those thoughts deviate from reality, those are called cognitive distortions. Now, we all have cognitive distortions. This is a completely normal part of human thinking and human experience. But sometimes we can recognize that there are certain patterns of cognitive distortions we engage in more than others. And we also find that certain patterns are more strongly linked to anxiety and depression. And there's research suggesting that changing some of those distortions, even just by recognizing that these thoughts are not necessarily a reflection of reality, and being able to sort of see the thoughts differently and not immediately buy into them, there's some good evidence to suggest that that can actually help us feel a lot better. So let's jump into some examples of these distortions. One's called polarization. This is sometimes called all or nothing thinking or black and white thinking. It says everything is great or it's terrible. I am perfect or I'm a failure. So for example, if you're a high achiever in school and you really want to get an A on the exam and you get a B, you might feel as though you have completely underperformed or it's almost like you failed, even though many people would agree a B is a very good grade. And another example might be if you are working on a project and you really want to knock it out of the park because it's really important to you and you do an okay job. The polarization, the all or nothing thinking, translates that into, well, I have failed because I didn't achieve perfection or it wasn't great, therefore it's terrible. Another example is called catastrophizing. This is what it sounds like. This is jumping to the absolute worst case scenario. So going back to our exam example, I didn't get an A on my exam, and so I'm not going to do well in the class, and that means I'm not going to get into med school, and that means I'm not going to be able to pursue the career that I want, and I'm going to end up, having to move back home with my parents, or I'm not going to be able to pay my rent. Or, the project example, let's say I was, working on something for my boss and I didn't do a great job on it. And so immediately jumping to a scenario of they'll be so upset with me, I'll be fired, I'll lose my job, and then I will end up, homeless and unable to get another good job in the future. So going from sort of worst case scenario in the current situation, taking it all the way out to more and more worst case scenarios until where you end up as an absolute catastrophe. Catastrophizing is really common in anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder in particular. Magnification is another one. This is blowing things out of proportion. Now, we are doing this on purpose when we magnify. We're not intending to perceive things as more important or scarier or more significant than they really are. This is something that happens without us realizing it. So magnification, an example might be that we have an interaction with a friend and they seem a little snippy with us and a little short. Magnification might mean blowing that up into thinking that the person is incredibly angry at you or that they just dislike you as a person, rather than being able to sort of perceive it as one relatively isolated event that doesn't bear on the rest of your interactions with that person. Minimization is the flip side of this. This is playing something down that actually is sort of important. So for example, if you're somebody who maybe uses alcohol to cope with anxiety, and you find yourself, drinking before parties or, drinking on a more regular basis, you might feel tempted to minimize that, to say, well, it's not that much of a problem, or there are other people that drink plenty more than I do, or I'm in college, everybody drinks heavily in college. And if it turns out that in reality, your drinking is actually interfering with your health or causing some problems in your life, we would call that minimizing, that sort of dismissing it and thinking as if it's not important when it is. Jumping to conclusions is another big one in anxiety. And there are a couple kinds of jumping to conclusions that we'll talk about. All right, so one example is mind reading. This is huge in social anxiety. Mind reading means assuming I know what someone else is thinking, or guessing what somebody else is thinking and then reacting as if that were absolutely true. So going back to this example where your friend is a little short with you, thinking, oh, they're so angry at me, or, oh, I must have said something wrong or stupid, or I guess they don't like me. Reacting as if that is actually what they are thinking, as opposed to just something that you're guessing that they might be thinking. Fortune telling is another example. So fortune telling is essentially assuming we know what's going to happen in the future. We might predict that, you know, oh, I'm gonna do so badly on this project. I'm gonna completely mess this up. And we're already, you know, 3 steps, 4 steps down the road, way into the future, when we can't actually know how it's gonna turn out. You know, sometimes things are self-fulfilling prophecies. We might have a prediction and then do things that, you know, maybe we might, you know, make come true. So if we feel like, if we have the thought that, you know, this project is going to go terribly, we might do things like avoid working on it, which can lead to it going terribly. But often fortune telling will be things that are completely out of our control. I just know this terrible thing is going to happen, and reacting as if that is true, as opposed to experiencing that thought as a prediction that may or may not be true. Emotional reasoning. This is, I feel, therefore it is. I have this feeling, therefore the thought that goes with it must be true. For example, I feel really embarrassed, I feel ashamed, and therefore it must be true that the thing I said was really dumb, or that the person doesn't like me. Because otherwise, why would I be feeling so embarrassed? Should statements. A lot of cognitive behavioral therapists really love this phrase, you're shoulding all over yourself. Should statements are rules we apply to ourselves about what we should be doing. Now, there are some things we should do. So for example, you know, if you're at work and your boss asks you to do a task, or your professor gives you an assignment, you know, we know where those rules and expectations are coming from. They're coming from the boss, they're coming from the professor, and so on. But often we'll have these expectations that we place on ourselves about how we should be, or that we place on others about how others should be. And it's not clear where these rules came from, or who decided it should be this way, or who is arbitrating that reality. And so often should statements can lead us to feel really guilty if they're things that we're placing on ourselves, or maybe angry or frustrated if they're expectations we're placing on others, especially if those expectations are unrealistic, either the ones that we're placing on ourselves, or the ones that we're placing on others, or the ones that we're placing on reality. It shouldn't be like this. Well, says who? Right? And so recognizing when we're placing should statements on ourselves and on others in particular can be really useful for helping to think about, you know, is this actually an expectation that I want to hold? Is this reasonable? Do I actually believe this about myself? And would I tell a friend they should be doing the same thing or feeling the same way? And you see me starting to challenge those a little bit. And, you know, we'll come back to chatting about, you know, what you do with these statements once you're aware of them. But recognizing a should statement for what it is can be a useful step toward disengaging from it if it's not actually a set of rules we really want to be applying. Overgeneralizing. This is taking, you know, one small interaction and extrapolating it out as if it was you know, a huge pattern. So for example, let's say that we're driving in traffic and somebody cuts us off and gets in front of us. We might assume, you know, that person is just a bad driver, or that person is a jerk based on this one example of their behavior. Well, what we're doing there is an example of the fundamental attribution error, which is a kind of overgeneralizing. The fundamental attribution error is that we will often attribute our own behavior to the situation. We explain what we're doing because of what's going on around us. And that's how we understand our own behavior. But we will often see other people's behavior as indicating who they are as a person. So this one example that I have of your behavior, that is how I understand who you are. Mental filter. This is one that is not always negative, but is often negative in the context of anxiety and depression. Only paying attention to certain kinds of information, only paying attention to negative information, and disregarding positive information. So often folks with social anxiety will do something we call post-event processing, which is thinking back about social interactions and kind of replaying them and looking for, where, like, did I say something wrong? Did they seem unhappy? Where did I mess up? And so on. And in scanning through those events, looking just for negative information and sort of ignoring the positive information, what we end up with is we've, encoded, so paid attention to and sort of processed and then mentally rehearsed, practiced examples of situations where we've done poorly or we've gotten sort of negative feedback from somebody else, and we lose all that information about things that actually went well and evidence that the person is happy with us or does like us and so on. And so mental filter, sometimes called discounting the positives in depression, for example, is another one to definitely be aware of. All right, so what do we do about this? Well, the good news is that once we recognize that our thoughts are not always related, really even necessarily in any meaningful way, to what is actually happening in reality, that can be a good step toward, as I said before, breaking out of that habit of immediately buying into everything you think. And so being able to take a step back and say, is this thought actually true, or am I just thinking it? Even just recognizing that thoughts are not necessarily reality can be a useful step towards starting to, again, distance yourself from those thoughts and start to challenge them. And cognitive interventions, the cognitive part of cognitive behavioral therapy, will often focus on helping somebody learn to spot those patterns in their own thinking and to pick them out and start to either challenge them in certain kinds of therapy or for certain kinds of problems, or to just be aware of them and practice not engaging with them in other kinds of therapy or for other kinds of problems.